Solar power. Is it a reliable and viable primary source of electricity? The biggest challenge to relying on solar as a go-to energy source is access to direct sunlight. In Canada, it only works as a supplemental source of energy and only in select areas. For solar to be the primary and solo source of reliable energy, the panels need to be exposed to direct sunlight for extensive periods of time every day, and the sun has to shine bright. Africa has sun, and lots of it. Malawi and West Africa in particular is an ideal place for solar to be the primary source of electricity. Add in the fact it's a place with limited access to hydropower. In fact, you're lucky if you can get electricity 25% of the time. The problem is a dwindling supply of water. The reservoir is too low. When the turbines in the dam stop spinning, diesel generators turn on and produce what amounts to stopgap power. It's costly, it's environmentally unfriendly, and until now it was the only option. Now, with advances in solar technology and a drop in the cost of the panels, solar is competitive with diesel. Even better, solar is hyperlocal. The appropriate number of panels can be installed within meters of the community that requires the electricity. This reduces costs and environmental footprint, as well as creates economic opportunities and wealth. We invited Justin Woodward to join us for a conversation that matters about the tricky business of establishing a solar power plant in Malawi that has the potential to transform economies that until now lived with intermittent and unreliable electricity.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me, and I find it fascinating. You were born and raised here in Vancouver, and yet you've decided to go and try and introduce solar energy into Africa and in some cases into the Middle East, or even as far east as sort of the Indian subcontinent. What is it about solar energy that made you say, okay, there's an opportunity, one, and two, there's an opportunity halfway around the world?
So it wasn't a conscious decision to go from into the Middle East or into Africa. It was much more an evolution that was born out of sort of right place, right time, where Ontario had come out with a feed-in tariff program, which is effectively a subsidized system to procure renewable energy. So we had a relatively successful run at Ontario for 3 years, and then it's a very political, power is a very political issue, and so as new administrations came in, they sort of rolled out the old subsidy program, and so that was a very obvious opportunity at that time. And so we were sitting there scratching our heads, sort of saying, what do we do now, and where?
In Africa, how does solar get to compete against any other sort of form of electrical generation, which I'm sure they have a little bit of hydroelectric, and they would have some coal-generated power generation as well.
Yeah, so every country is a bit different, but basically on the continent you have depending on the country, but base loads either coal or gas, and then some countries have also a mix of hydro. So a country we're operating in, Malawi, is basically 100% hydro. And what you've seen, this question about solar being competitive has changed a lot, even over the past 2 years. So you've seen solar pricing come down almost exponentially in the past 5 years. And so where solar was once being procured in Ontario for big projects was 44 cents a kilowatt hour. You're seeing that same price below 10 cents a kilowatt hour now. And so when you look at because the cost of solar has come down so much, particularly when you add that with sunny places, solar is generally now the cheapest form of power that you can put in almost any of these countries that have high sun resources.
Because it's less expensive to set up, and the overall cost of production is lower. Exactly,
it's less expensive to set up, and it's sunnier, so the same panel there produces much more power than it does, say, in the northern hemisphere. So you sort of have a big switch now from people were thinking gas and coal were the cheapest, and now really it is solar.
So long as you're in that kind of sunny environment. Or are you saying
correct.
almost anywhere?
Now it's actually almost anywhere, with the exception of maybe places like Canada, or say Ontario or BC, where you don't have a high solar irradiance, and you also have very cheap. You have quite a lot of resources, say in BC, for instance, where there's a lot of hydro and can be built out relatively cheaply. But there's only a lot of the world now. Solar is one of the most competitive technologies.
And I guess therein lies the challenge about, well, do we invest in Canada or do we go somewhere else where there is a greater abundance of sunlight hours?
Exactly, yeah. And so in Canada, the markets, you're sort of seeing more activity in Alberta, where it is sunnier than a lot of the other provinces. Or the US, which is quite a similar sort of risk appetite, where you do see solar very, very cheap in the southern US. But for us, really, you're competing with big pensions, quite large companies, and really you're seeing utilities and a large amount of money moving into these types of projects in North America, where it's much harder for a company like us, who started 8 years ago, to compete with those types of, and that cost of capital. So that's where we have found a niche outside of Canada, and really are sort of adding value to these markets.
So I've got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
So what is the structure like when it comes to wanting to set up a power generation facility, let's say in Malawi?
Yeah.
What does the government say to you? Okay, go ahead, we'll buy it from you, but the rest of it is up to you. Or do they come in with guaranteed contracts and some money up front to help underwrite some of your costs?
So it's complicated.
Always is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly in Africa. So maybe development will take Malawi will probably be 6 or 7 years door to door when we started to actually having the project completed, and the first 5 to 6 of that is just setting up these contracts and trying to raise financing and structuring the risks away, and sort of asking the government to say, you take this political risk, we'll take this risk, our contractor will take the construction risk. And so really what it looks like is us approaching the government saying, we understand you have a generation problem. We think we have a solution, and here's a range of what we think the cost will be. And you sort of enter into an MOU, and then the next following few years is feasibility and negotiating the contracts. But effectively, it's normally a state-owned utility that's the off-taker on these projects, that's buying the power. And because the financial health of these entities are not always great, you need a guarantee from the government to step in the case there's a default under the utilities defaulting under the contract.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, we typically also get the World Bank or African Development Bank or some sort of multilateral institution to come in and then also wrap the whole thing and say, okay, well, if the utility defaults and the state defaults, then the World Bank will step in and we'll guarantee the whole thing. And that's where the timing really can take a long time.
In essence, you're building an insurance policy for yourself.
Exactly, yeah.
And how difficult is that to do, and then be able to turn around and go out to investors and say, now we think that you should invest in this project?
So if you get to that end point where you've got a state guarantee and you've got the World Bank or African Development Bank or the US government or someone insuring it, you've basically taken a lot of the actual risk out of the project, where a lot of your perceived risks in Africa are either insured or put onto the government or to your contractor. So at that point, it's actually relatively straightforward to raise funding. Mm-hmm. And because there's a perceived risk there, generally the returns are higher in Africa than you would see in the US or Canada. But really what you're looking at is it's operational risk of a solar plant. and default risk of your insurance policy. And the operating risk is relatively nominal, and if the World Bank's not going to pay you, that's a sort of a AAA investment grade rated risk.
So when it comes to securing a site, how do you go about doing that in a jurisdiction that has a completely different mindset around property ownership? And
yeah, that's a very good question. That's probably the hardest part in sort of greenfield development, especially in Africa, where you're right. So in Canada, you have a public registry where it says, Joe is the owner of this lot, and here's the coordinates, and
measured down to the inch, and
and everyone, it's very public, and it's a sort of database that everyone can sort of pull up. In Africa, so we've got projects in Nigeria, Cameroon, and Malawi. They're all sort of the same theme of how these sites work, but generally you have a customary authority, sort of a traditional authority, like a chief or something, that has their own view of whose land is who, and that's kind of what the towns follow or the people follow, and so he has an idea and sort of allocates land. You then have the state or province that has their own land officers that have their own view on things, and then you have the federal that, and often they're they're definitely not coordinated, and sometimes they're conflicting. So really it is having, one of the things we always have is a local partner that has done, especially the land process before. And it is a lot of hand-holding on, this is what the chief thinks, this is what the federal government thinks. And then to get financing on these projects, because it is debt or the World Bank's involved, you have to do everything up to these global environmental performance standards. And so you have to layer on making sure that if you are displacing someone's field where you're putting a panel on it, they have to be compensated, or you make sure that their lives are no less off. So then you layer on IFC performance standards on resettlement issues. Not physical resettlement, just economic, and the land process can take 2 or 3 years, and it's very consultant involved and very hands-on, from having someone basically there once a week trying to figure out make sure there's sort of expectations and you're not upsetting anyone.
This is our second break. We'll be back in a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
So when we take a look at a country like Malawi, what is their ability to produce power so the general population in any industry that's moving in has an adequate or even an abundant supply, so that every time they flip on the switch, the lights come on?
So in Malawi, I think the electrification rates are about 11%, 11 or 12%.
What does that mean? That means 11% of people get the power that they want, and then the rest are without?
Exactly. So Malawi is a very extreme case of a country that's sort of in dire straits right now of demand for power, which is also why it's one of our, I think we see probably the best opportunity there, because you do have a very willing government willing to work with you, as opposed to sort of negotiate constantly. So Malawi's electrification rates are 11% or 12%, in that range. And on top of that, you've had, so they're 98% hydro. Climate change has really impacted their wet season and water levels. So a lot of their hydro reserves are operating, or hydro dams are operating at about 40% of capacity. So you have this sort of compounded impact where not many people are getting power, and power that they did have is actually much worse because they're having record droughts. And so you have basically a constant crisis right now in Malawi, where there's rolling load shedding for much of the industry, and countries just, even if you can get power, there's none going through the lines. And so you have, back to the competitiveness, they just put in these emergency diesel generators, about 80 megawatts of them, where they're paying upwards of 40 cents a kilowatt hour, which is incredibly expensive for baseload power. And then you try and
it only gives you 80.
Yeah, and it's a fraction of what the country needs, but at least it helps sort of timing an industry and stabilize the grid. But if you put that cost of power onto a very poor population, I mean, they can't afford it. Effectively, the government's just almost, it's bleeding cash right now, just trying to keep the lights on because people can't pay that tariff.
Wow.
So they're screaming at us saying, come in, put in solar like as quickly as you can. We just need you to come in and just turn off this diesel generator because.
And still you say it'll be a 5 to 7 year process before you're going to be up and running, despite the fact that they're in dire straits?
No, so that's now, so it took them, working with them for 4 years, and then they were, the droughts have gotten worse and the power situation's gotten worse, and so really we've seen, even over the past year, like a very, something switched where, someone's raised their hand and said, this is a much bigger problem than we thought.
So their enthusiasm for the project went up.
Yeah.
So what are you proposing? What are you going to build there in Malawi that's going to be able to help them? And then what will the outcome be? How many more people will have access to power?
Yeah, so we're not increasing access yet. That's kind of the next version of where I think Africa will go. But so what we're doing is effectively there's an existing transmission line and infrastructure. So we're just putting more power into that line, and so
just so that it can get up to capacity.
Exactly. So they have about 380 megawatts of these big hydro dams. At any point in time, there's only about 200 megawatts operational. So we are adding another 80 megawatts. So there's one site that's about 200 hectares and another site that's about 100 hectares. Those two sites, they're fully permitted now. We're just finalizing our contracts, and we should be starting construction by hopefully October.
You've ordered the panels?
No, that'll be the notice to proceed. So we'll pull the trigger in hopefully October, and we'll have people sort of clearing the land. But that will basically add 25%, 30% more power to the grid. The one issue solar does have is because it is intermittent and you can't control when the sun's shining or the clouds are coming, you do need a certain amount of hydro or base load running so solar can complement it. So our first project is actually going to have a little battery bank plus solars just to help the intermittency of it.
Right, so that you have reliable power.
Exactly, yeah.
Third and final break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
Wow. And so if that's all you're going to get to with these two fields that you're going to, solar fields that you're going to be putting in, how many more do you have lined up that you're hoping to bring into that country?
So for us, the way we strategically look at markets is we try and have one sort of anchor project. Let's do a pilot. Let's do one, 100 hectare, 200 hectare site, 20 to 50 megawatts. Once that's up and running, you have built track record and relationships with most government stakeholders, and there's a lot of cowboys in Africa saying they can do things that don't ever get done. Mm-hmm. So once you do actually deliver, the idea is that we then can expand regionally into projects 2, 3, 4, and 5 and start looking at different business models. So we are starting to look at mini grids or off-grid solar, and it's a bit hard to get scale, but if you do have an anchor project that is, it's a $20 to $40 million investment for us, then you can start, adding another 2 or 3, or at least sort of smaller business models makes sense.
Well, that leads to my next question. What's it cost just to get what you've got on the books right now up and running? Yeah, so
the project in Malawi will be about a $80 million project.
To build out,
yeah. And so of which 3/4 will come from lenders, financiers, and then we're contributing the equity. So and that sort of foreign direct investment in Malawi is significant. Like they don't typically see private sector projects that big. So,
always when we hear about resource development or anything here, there's the question of, are you going to be able to hire locally to be able to provide some construction jobs and maybe some training that comes with that? Is the appropriate workforce available to you in Malawi, or you're going to have to bring people in from out of the country to be able to build the sites?
So I think there's one good thing about solar is it's not a very complicated construction project. So you basically have your civil works, which is for any construction projects you can typically find those laborers, and then we're just going through the negotiations with our contractors now about one of the things, particularly because you have these multilateral groups backing us, they don't want us to bring in a fleet of foreigners, take a whole bunch of jobs, disturb the community, and then leave. So,
well, if electricity is the oxygen of the modern economy, you then are helping to deliver that modern economy to areas that don't have it, but you're allowing them also to leapfrog across sort of the infrastructure barriers that may have existed there before.
Because of the lack of power, there's it's like 4 or 5 there's billions of dollars being clipped off their GDP just because of the or maybe it's 3%, but an astronomical amount because they don't have power. So really these projects should unlock a huge sort of trickle-on effect in their economies where people can actually start setting up, with reliable power, they can start setting up businesses where they can produce goods reliably and don't have to have a generator turned on all the time that's horrendously expensive.
Well, and without that, there's no way that Africa can realize its potential.
Our belief is that kind of like how, so the first sort of iteration of projects in Africa are these grid-connected big utility ones. And what Africa also did on the mobile side, where they skipped the process of putting in telephone wires everywhere, they went straight to cell towers and a distributed mobile system, where now everyone in Africa has one, if not 2 or 3 phones, where I think power will happen very similar, where these centralized generators, with these big physical infrastructure to get out, will be obsolete when you start putting in these localized mini grids or distributed power, and everyone becomes their own little generator.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be an exciting time, not only for you as a business person, but also knowing that you are delivering a clean source of energy to Africa.
Yeah. And you do see, it is practically very noticeable when you're going around. You see generators just turned on all the time. You see people burning biomass. They're burning wood, or they're burning kerosene, it's very obvious how little, but how the power that they do have does come from quite carbon-intensive sources.
Well, I wish you all the best, and thanks for coming in and sharing what you're doing. It sounds like a very exciting time.